she once again took advantage of the International Deaconess Network and spent a year in residency at the Chicago Training School, founded and run by its longtime principal, Lucy Ryder Meyer. After that year, she went back to New Zealand, where she worked at the South Island Methodist Orphanage and Children's Home in Christchurch. In 1917, she traveled again to the United States to work in several positions. Then she made one final transoceanic trip to Sydney, Australia, to work at the YWCA until her death in 1922. 3 words in her obituary capture the international character of her deaconess work. She had, quote, a singularly peripatetic career, unquote. Don't you love that? Singularly peripatetic career. Now, the whole point of this book and of this lecture is that she was able to pursue this ambitious itinerary because it relied on a vast and well-oiled international Methodist deaconess pipeline, across which ideas, personnel, and communication flowed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so, as I mentioned, the purpose of this lecture is to illuminate just one aspect of this international women's movement, and that is its uniformity. How little it varied despite geographical distances, oceans in between, how little it varied in its pattern of emergence, growth, and then decline in country after country. So, let's keep going. Decades before most Methodist churches had established a clear path to women's ordination, thousands of single women in their 20s and 30s, the daughters of farmers and skilled workers, traveled from their rural homes and small towns in Europe, North America, and Australasia to a deaconess home or training school, where they received theological and practical training in preparation for becoming a Methodist deaconess. Upon the church's approval, they were consecrated to the office of deaconess by the laying on of hands by a bishop or a minister during a public worship service. They lived in community with other deaconesses and devoted themselves to service, diakonia in the Greek, hence the term deaconess, to service particularly with the urban poor as teachers, nurses, evangelists, pastors, administrators, missionaries, and social service workers. To give you a personal sense, I'm going to be doing broad strokes. When you're talking about an international topic, you have to kind of do the meta view. But I want to begin by showing you, just introducing you to 5 Methodist deaconesses, each from a different country. So first we're going to meet Sister Laura Francis, who penned a letter to Reverend Taylor of the Central Methodist Mission in Sydney, offering to work for the mission. The story goes that she threatened to join the Salvation Army if there was no avenue of service in her own church. Very smart, Reverend Taylor responded favorably, and in 1890, Francis entered the First Sisters of the People home. The Sisters of the People was the early name for Methodist deaconesses in Australia. After several years in Sydney, she went to Auckland, New Zealand to work with the Helping Hand Mission, where she founded Door of Hope, a hostel for prostitutes and unwed mothers. Next, let's meet Elise Searle, who was elected to the Board of Guardians in 1895 in Norwich, England. As a member of the Relief Committee, she worked to change the diet for those classified as infirm in order to nourish them with better food, to increase the supply of towels at the local hospital, and to improve the food at the workhouse. As a deaconess entrusted with providing spiritual care, she would slip out of board meetings and lead those waiting in line for a monetary help in a familiar hymn like Jesu, lover of my soul, and safe in the arms of Jesus. Marie Bagger was one of 3 deaconesses tapped to start a Methodist deaconess work in Oslo, Norway in 1897. Born in Denmark, she took nursing courses in Copenhagen and traveled to the US to work with the mentally ill and to the UK to work with people living in impoverished communities. So you see in her life, again, this peripatetic career, Norway, Denmark, the United States, UK, and back to Oslo, where she brought this vast international experience to her deaconess work in Oslo. And she moved into a slum area to care for the most vulnerable children and their mothers in the district. Anna E. Hall was one of the first Black women to complete a one-year certificate at the New England Training School in Boston. The following year, in 1902, she was consecrated a deaconess. She served for several years at her alma mater, the Thayer Industrial School, a school for Black children founded by the Woman's Home Missionary Society. After several years serving as a deaconess in the US, in 1906, she became a missionary in Liberia, where she remained for 25 years. And finally, Fidela Gadula, a Filipino deaconess in the first graduating class in 1907 of Harris Memorial Training School in Manila, served in 4-month stays in remote villages. She engaged in house-to-house visitation, taught Sunday school, assisted the pastor, and trained the pastor's wife how to teach the Bible. This miscellany of Methodist deaconesses, whose greatest influence spanned a half-century and more than half the globe, documents a sliver of the thousands of women who took up the mantle, the curriculum, the commitment, and the costume of the Methodist deaconess movement. And while they shared a common vocation, as you've seen already, they exercised their calling in many ways and in myriad places. So as we look at the emergence of the International Methodist Deaconess Movement, the reason I date it to 1874 is that the deaconess movement, Methodist deaconess movement, began in Germany with the founding of the Bethany Association, the Deaconess Society for Medical Care and Nursing, under the auspices of the Methodist Church in Germany. Then 2 years later, the mother house of that association established the first permanent deaconess station in Frankfurt. In total, there would go on to be 3 separate German Methodist deaconess organizations, each with headquarters in a different city, Frankfurt, Elberfeld, and Nuremberg. And they were launched between 1874 and 1889. And from Germany, they spread throughout much of Europe. Now, the emergence of the Methodist deaconess movement in Germany can be traced to the influence of Kaiserswerth, where the modern Protestant deaconess movement commenced several decades earlier in 1836. In Kaiserswerth, which is a small town on the Rhine River, 6 miles from Dusseldorf, Reverend Theodor Fliedner, a Lutheran minister, founded a deaconess mother house with a wide-ranging outreach, particularly in nursing. Kaiserswerth grew exponentially in size, stature, and influence. By 1910, the numbers associated with Kaiserswerth were staggering. They had started 84 mother houses, 7,200 substations, and had close to 20,000 deaconesses. And I will say that Jack and I had the privilege of visiting Kaiserswerth. It's very, especially if you have a modicum of German and can translate a little bit of the museum, it's incredible what this deaconess movement was about in Kaiserswerth. So Kaiserswerth had a reputation as a transnational space, and that stemmed from the number of international visitors who spent time there observing the deaconesses at work. For instance, well-known there, Florence Nightingale, you might have heard of her, right? Florence Nightingale first observed deaconesses as nurses when she visited Kaiserswerth in 1850 and then again in 1851. She wrote a pamphlet about Kaiserswerth, which she published anonymously, but still it broadcast widely the existence of this deaconess institution. And there are a number of international Methodist luminaries who visited Kaiserswerth from the United States, from the UK, from countries across Europe and Australia. So it's very easy to see the imprint, especially on British Methodism from Kaiserswerth. So then from Germany, the movement crossed the Atlantic to Chicago, where, as if you remember, Isabel Sinclair spent a year. And Lucy Ryder-Meyer, the founder of the school, welcomed the first students in October of 1885. And then 3 years later, the Methodist Episcopal Church established the office of deaconess by vote of General Conference, the highest legislative body of the denomination. And from my records, this would have been the first office of deaconess established in the Methodist tradition. So over the next decade, Methodist work began in other countries, for instance, and you see the dates, 1890, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, Norway, Sweden, and the Philippines. And you see how it really, really got momentum going. And then in the U.S., there were 2 additional Methodist churches, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, and then the Methodist Church South, because the denominations were split at that time. Each authorized an office of deaconess. So this just gives you a sense of the global nature of this movement. Now, if you're an historian, you'll know that the expansion of this international movement coincided with seismic changes for women in all areas of society, from higher education to increased professional opportunities to women's suffrage. More women than ever, nearly 6 million in the United States Census of 1900, earned wages outside the home. And between 1890 and 1900, the number of women in industry increased faster than the number of men in industry, and it increased faster than the birth rate. As to suffrage, New Zealand was the first country to grant women's suffrage in 1893. The following year, suffrage passed in South Australia for white women. In 1906, Finland became the first European country to grant women's suffrage. And by 1915, the vote for women's suffrage had passed in most Scandinavian countries, and then finally the UK and the United States caught up. So I just wanted to give you a sense, there's so much more to say, but I don't think it is, I think it's very interesting, the seismic changes for women and the growth in the deaconess movement, and I don't think that it is unrelated. The impact on women of the suffrage movement exceeded that of the right to vote, as Anne O'Brien explains for the Australian context. And she says, it inspired women to become involved outside of their usual social spheres. At the same time, churches were experiencing a need for labor within the church because men were drifting away from church jobs. Protestant churches began to employ women to work independently as missionaries and deaconesses to fulfill labor needs without completely usurping male clergy. Now keep an eye on that last phrase, okay? We're going to dig a little deeper into without completely usurping male clergy, okay? So the gist of this was that Methodist deaconesses were heavily recruited during this era in which Protestant churches attempted to, quote, solve the social question, unquote, particularly for the urban poor whose already dire living conditions were becoming worse with rampant industrialization. In Germany, for example, a seismic migration from rural to urban industrial areas took place, and by 1910, only 40% of the population remained in the countryside. Here in the UK, innovations in technology, science, and industry arrived in company with urban pollution, child labor abuses, poverty, and disease. Across the Atlantic in the U.S., the rate of immigration reached 800,000 people annually, and immigrants arrived with their own dress, language, customs, and religions, which seemed threatening to older stock Americans. So these complex realities raised a pivotal question for Methodist churches about how, particularly if they were located in an urban area, how they could keep their membership intact while simultaneously serving and evangelizing so many people from so many countries and so many of them with pressing needs. The answer for visionary leaders lay in a previously untapped resource: single Methodist women ready and eager to engage in full-time religious work. So here you have this coalescence of the groundswell of women's activity outside of the traditional familial sphere, the predominance of women already engaged in church activities, and pressing social needs all around, combined to make becoming a deaconess, particularly from women from the lower and to middle classes, an attractive option with its educational and practical training in a profession. So let's turn to the growth of this movement and look at just a few examples of who helped this to get started. And there was typically an advocate or group of advocates who stepped up to introduce the idea of deaconess to their constituencies. And one of those were clergymen. So like here in the UK, the Reverend Dr. Thomas Bowman Stevenson, a Wesleyan Methodist minister, wanted to start a deaconess movement because he had already started a children's home in London, and he needed more people, more women, to staff the school. And so deaconesses seemed like a good idea to him. Under the leadership of the Reverend Christian Golder, deaconess work began in 1896 among German Methodists in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I will say that I am a product of Cincinnati, Ohio. We had our step-grandmother spoke German, and I think about this time, Cincinnati was about 50% German-speaking. So it's not surprising that it became the birthplace of deaconesses in German Methodism. And then Reverend Reverdy Ransom from the AME Church was responsible for getting deaconesses started with his impassioned pleas and advocacy first brought deaconesses to the church's attention. So you had clergymen, and then you also, particularly in the United States, had powerful laymen women who also were at the advocacy for the deaconess movement. So here you have, I've mentioned Lucy Ryder Meyer already a couple of times. She started the Chicago Training School. And then Jane Bancroft Robinson did a European tour and saw all of the deaconess work already going on in Germany and France and Switzerland. And she came back and talked to the Women's Home Missionary Society and said, this is a great idea. Now, unfortunately, these were very powerful women, incredibly well educated, both had PhDs, and yet they spent, my first article in the deaconess movement is called A 30 Years War, because they never did agree on how to house, who should have authority for these deaconesses. And instead of combining forces, they ended up, it was a tragedy, to be honest. And then, so that's the Northern Church. And then in the Southern Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, you had Belle Harris Bennett, who was a dynamo. She was president of both the Foreign and the Home Missionary Societies for the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and she used her stature and influence to pass the office of deaconess in 1902 in the Southern Church. So again, the advocates stepping up, deciding this was a good thing. And then very small beginnings for this deaconess work. So for instance, The oldest mother house of Methodist deaconesses in Germany, as I mentioned, in Frankfurt, began with one deaconess who lived in the minister's study. That's a small beginning, one deaconess who lived in the minister's study. And then, as you see here, as I mentioned, the Chicago Training School commenced with 5 students in 1885, and as you've already heard with Sister Laura Francis, who threatened to go to the Salvation Army, Reverend Taylor opened a home with 4 women in Sydney, Australia in 1890. In 1903, deaconesses began in the Philippines when the Women's Foreign Missionary Society of the Methodist Church purchased an old Spanish home and established a training school in Manila. It too had a modest beginning with 4 girls between the ages of 14 and 16 who came from Tagalog-speaking towns around Manila. And you'll notice that this is named Harris. Norman Waite Harris was a philanthropist banker in Chicago, and he gave a lot of money to Chicago Training School, and he gave a lot of money to the Philippines to start this school. And that's another thing that's been fascinating for me to study, and I won't be able to talk about it tonight, is philanthropy and who has the purse strings and all of that. But you can read the book on that. So I want you to see that this was a minuscule beginning. And keep that in mind as we talk now about the growth, this dramatic impact of, despite these modest beginnings, the movement's growth would prove to be astonishing. So the Martha Maria Deaconess Society in Nuremberg, which I was privileged to be able to visit their archives, started in Nuremberg, and then within 3 years it had gone on to 3 more cities in Germany and Austria. Across the ocean in the United States, the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Church in 1900, after 12 years, reported under its direction 32 deaconess institutions, homes, schools, and hospitals, 300 deaconesses, and property valued at nearly $500,000. In Dunedin, New Zealand, Sister Alice, the Central Mission nursing sister, made a staggering number of visits. Just one woman, she made 1,650 visits in just 1 year in 1907 to the poor and the sick, and this number averages out to 31 visits a week. But if you like nuts and bolts, let's look for a minute at this report compiled by the superintendent of the Toronto Methodist Deaconess work for 1 year, which illuminates not only extensive numerical statistics, but also an expansive breadth of work, including religious visitation for prayer, Bible study in homes, hospitals and jails, nursing the sick, taking children for homestays or day-long outings to the countryside in what was known as fresh air work. So just look at some of these for a minute. Number of canvassing calls, nearly 11,000. Calls upon missionary and parish calls, over 16,000. Papers and tracts distributed, over 7,000. And look at this. New garments distributed, half-worn garments distributed, 10,000. And they supplied fuel. They took children on, as I said, on these outings. And then they're teaching Sunday school, kitchen garden, sewing school, and on and on. And you look at that, hours spent in nursing, almost 2,300 in sewing, and then in classwork. So do you get an extent? This was just 1 year, and I think it was about 20 or so. So not a lot of women doing this work. So this pattern of growth reflected a common international experience. Advocates led to the founding of institutions, which led in ways both dramatic and modest to an impact that extended well beyond the comparatively few women who populated these earliest Methodist deaconess institutions. Now, we're going to pivot for a minute. While this was true for white deaconesses, it was not the same for black deaconesses. And we're going to look a little bit at this even more obscure story that I have had to, thanks to Lucy's spouse, Alex, help me uncover Rosa Simpson. It just takes a lot of digging into archives to find a lot of this material, especially about women. I found the name of Rosa Simpson in a footnote. And so to be able to even write 4 or 5 pages on her in the book, I'm quite proud of. So, as I'm saying, the Methodist Deaconess movement in the United States unfolded with a different pattern for black women within the predominantly white Methodist Episcopal Church. Black women already had to endure horrific Jim Crow laws that emboldened racism to operate freely in every sphere of daily and national life. In addition, specific to the Deaconess movement, there was never established even one permanent training school for black women who aspired to become Methodist deaconesses. While white women were able to study at a number of institutions across the country, black women did not have access even to one training school that stayed open for longer than 2 to 3 years before it closed due to lack of funding. Every time due to lack of funding. Every attempt to establish a black deaconess training school remained underfunded. We're going to return to my home state city again. For instance, Reverend Walter Riley, pastor of Mount Zion Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and his wife began a training school in their living room. And these, who you see, the women you see in the picture, are the women who were trained in his living room. Riley described the school he administered to the audience gathered for the 1901 National Women's Home Missionary Society meeting. He reported that 7 women, quote, were at work during the day and had to study and recite in the evenings, unquote. In other words, they worked double shifts, during the day as an employee, then as a student at night. When the Missionary Society's funds waned, to make up the financial gap, Riley even donated $200 of his own to keep the fledgling school in existence. Nevertheless, the homegrown training school closed within 3 years due to lack of funding. The Women's Home Missionary Society attempted another training school for black women in Atlanta in 1904 with the help of Anna Hall. But influenza broke out shortly after she arrived, and eventually in 1904 the school closed, and Anna Hall, as I mentioned, went to Liberia and served very successfully as a missionary there for 25 years. So in 1904, the year Riley's homegrown school closed and the training school in Atlanta was founded for about a year, the number of black deaconesses in the Methodist Church reached its apex at 12. And this was more than in any other Methodist church, including black Methodist churches like the AME. Despite, though, this Herculean obstacle of no permanent training school, the few black women who were consecrated as deaconesses worked tirelessly and effectively with minimal resources and training. So consider the statistics for MEC Deaconess Rosa Simpson, who I think by 1 year is the longest serving black Methodist deaconess at 33 years. I think Anna Hall did 32. I think, if I calculate, Rosa did 33. So she was a conference organizer. She traveled around Texas and organized societies for the Women's Home Missionary Society. In 1914, she traveled between 1,000 and 2,000 miles from her home in Galveston, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, as far as Paris, Texas, north of Dallas, and east as far as Texarkana, nearly to the Louisiana border. So this is a huge, if you've never been in Texas, it's a big state. And she recounted, listen to this, one woman, 1 year, between 1,000 and 2,000 miles, she made 6,479 visits, so nearly 6,500, to homes, hospitals, and jails during the year, and performed duties in visiting, reorganizing, and organizing local auxiliaries, unquote. In addition, if you're into church politics, she was elected 7 times consecutively from 1908 to 1932 as a Texas Annual Conference lay delegate to the Methodist General Conference, and that's a big political deal. Still, although she garnered the respect, obviously, of Texas Methodists to elect her repeatedly to this influential position, she had to rely on others for financial assistance to attend the meetings. And one of the people that she relied on is Jack Arthur Johnson, the first black world heavyweight boxing champion, nicknamed the Galveston Giant. They were both from Galveston, who paid her expenses to go to the 1912 General Conference in Minneapolis. She also, I have a lovely letter that I came across in Lucy Ryder-Meyer's diary, basically, that Lucy Ryder-Meyer gave Rosa Simpson some of her white ties and white bonnets. She just didn't have a lot of money. And unfortunately, despite her significant contribution to Methodism, what Simpson did during the decade between her retirement in 1936 and her death in obscurity in 1945 in a mental hospital in Austin, Texas, remains a mystery. Some things, as an historian, you just can't figure out, and you have to be at peace with that. Right, David? Okay, so I hope I've given you a sense of these amazing women, right? Okay, so we've looked at the emergence, we've talked about the modest beginnings, and then all of a sudden the dramatic growth. And then almost as quickly, there begins a decline. Nearly as rapid as the emergence of this international women's movement was its decline. The movement deteriorated precipitously after the First World War, as many deaconesses left their dark serge uniforms hanging in the closet and joined the nursing, social work, and teaching professions. What factors prompted this decline? There are more than what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about 3. The professionalization of work that supplanted deaconess work following the First World War, the on-the-ground reality that deaconesses remained in no man's land as neither clergy nor laity, and the vexing problem of a Protestant religious order which looked to many way too much like Roman Catholicism. So, let's go. World War I exercised a significant impact on women's moving in vast numbers into secular professions, prompted in some cases to support the war effort. With the men off to war, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Although many women returned to being housewives after the war, they had gained the vote in most countries, and there was no going back to what was before. So women looked increasingly to professions outside the church for employment. To train for these professions, women's enrollment increased in secular types of educational institutions, which then led to a decrease in enrollment in deaconess training schools. And even from within the church itself came the push for professionally trained workers to do what deaconesses had been doing, such as teaching Sunday school. According to Deaconess Alice Robertson, writing in 1919, the Board of Sunday Schools appeals for directors of religious education and insists upon a high grade of specialization. In other words, they wanted someone trained in this career specifically. And she found the same to be true of the Board of Home Missions and Church Extension, which was hiring trained leaders to do the same work that deaconesses had been doing. Now, it's a little bit, her prose is a little turgid, but I think this is a really important quote that raises this issue or explains this issue, I think, better than I could. What shall be called deaconess, and what shall be designated as non-deaconess? Just how the work of the non-deaconess church secretary differs from that of the church secretary who is a deaconess. In other words, it doesn't, right? The same question may be asked of religious education, social immigrant work, Sunday school teaching, go on and on. There's deaconesses had been doing this, but all of a sudden there was a push, even from within the church, for specialists. And this realization that women could do the same work for professional status and a salary, what deaconesses had done for neither, contributed to the movement's decline. Okay, so that's one, and there's much more to be said about that. But this is the one that really captured my attention, of course, being a clergywoman, but also thinking about women in no man's land, which is why I gave the title to the book. So they really remained in limbo, in no man's land, neither clergy nor laity, even though they were consecrated to an office in the church. So they weren't just hanging out here. They had been trained, deep theological education. That's another one of my favorite chapters, deep theological education, trained in what they were nurses and all of that. And then in a public worship service, they were brought into this office that had been created by the church. But it simply wasn't clear who they were in terms of a church position or role, or to whom they were to report. That also got messy. So for instance, I love this, a Canadian Methodist, a historian of the Canadian Methodist Deaconess movement documents, quote, a maze of conflicting commitments. The demands of their clients, in other words, the people that they're helping, notwithstanding, deaconesses answered to the pastor, the ladies' aid, and the church boards, which employed and supervised them, the general board of management, which stationed them, and the deaconess superintendents of the local homes who governed their off-duty lives, unquote. Given this labyrinth of conflicting commitments and lines of authority, the decline in the number of Canadian Methodist deaconesses began to emerge in 1910, only 16 years after it began in Toronto. In the New Zealand Methodist Church, there was a lack of clarity about which women serving in the church as full-time workers were actually deaconesses. So they were formally recognized in 1912, but as late as 1929, all women workers at home and overseas were listed in the minutes of conference as deaconesses. So let's just lump all these women serving no matter where, no matter what they're doing, into this one bucket of deaconesses. In the United States, the deaconess occupation of a place in no man's land can be traced directly to legislative debates, read fights, at General Conference. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I want to get to the quote that every one laughs at. Are you ready? So this is being discussed at the 1902 Methodist Episcopal Church South. What are we going to have an office of deaconess? And in at this discussion, the Reverend J.B. McGehee spoke for many of his colleagues when he declared that a favorable vote would be the first step in an advancement towards women's ordination. And this is how we put it. I am opposed to establishing a female hennery in the church for hatching out female preachers. Are you laughing? Okay. So the presiding bishop ruled his language out of order, but it's still in the minutes because I saw them there, and so they're permanently recorded in the conference minutes. And then I told you at the beginning that Iva Durham-Vennard was my favorite deaconess still. And the presiding elder of the St. Louis Annual Conference actually kicked her out while she was on maternity leave of the training school that she had founded and was principal. And he offered this rationale for his actions. Methodist preachers do not want deaconesses who study theology. We can attend to that ourselves. We want women as helpers who will work with the children, care for the sick, and visit the poor. If our deaconesses are trained in theology, they will become critical of the preachers, and that will be the end of the deaconess movement. And sadly, that's kind of what happened. In other words, when deaconess labors intersected with that of male clergy, conflict increased and deaconesses did not hold the reins of power. So perhaps this is a really interesting, there is not a lot on the AME deaconesses, but they did publish a manual in 1902. And in trying to tease out who's responsible for what in the sick room, the manual really lays it all out. But in that, you really see the difference between clergy and deaconesses. So what exactly are deaconess duties versus the clergymen's when you're tending to the sick? Well, the deaconesses were to follow these instructions. Acquaint your pastor of all cases needing his attention. He can do his work much better than you. And do not argue about religion with the pastor as to what you do or do not believe in the sick room. Be quiet and let him have the right of way. So what could they do? What could a deaconess do in the sick room? They could arrange the disordered room and bedclothes. Woohoo! Don't you want to get 2 years of theological training for that? Okay. So, but they're trying to draw the lines of authority in this murky, situation. But we as Methodists know the difficulty with this line in the sand is that precisely there in the sick room is where the deaconess could and perhaps should cross the line into pastoral care. After all, John Wesley, may he be revered, founder of Methodism, who made, and I got this from Jordan, made an initial foray into setting up deaconess movement as missionary in Georgia, had encouraged women in his sermon visiting the sick to, quote, inquire concerning the patient's soul when visiting the sick. Remember that? Yes, thank you, Jordan. That was a great piece. And further, this in your sick room, physical and spiritual are hard to, separate, right? So as an historian of German Methodist deaconesses explains, since the pastor could not always be present, very often the deaconesses were in charge of providing the patients and the dying with spiritual support by themselves when the pastor could not be there. In other words, the boundary between the spiritual guidance the pastors provided and the deaconess's care for the soul was not very distinct in everyday practice. Okay? So such a neat and tidy distinction was not always or even often possible. The need both to hold the line and cross it, especially in the sick room, and that's just one example, proved to be untenable for the Methodist deaconess movement. Okay, I'm having fun and I'm kind of taking too long, I know. So let's go on to the resemblance to Roman Catholicism, and this is a quicker one because it's kind of obvious, right? So, as I mentioned before, the very idea of a religious order in Protestantism disturbed many clergy and laity because it veered, as they perceived it, too close to Roman Catholicism. This critique was expressed from the beginning, and it was relentless. It never stopped. Not even the best efforts of deaconess advocates could silence such unremitting opposition. Like Roman Catholic nuns, deaconesses were single women who turned aside from what was considered the norm for women, which was to aspire to become a wife and mother. Like nuns in a convent, most deaconesses lived in community with other women. They wore a uniform, you've already seen some of those, that approximated a nun's habit, and many deaconesses remained unmarried, like nuns who were called to a celibate vocation. If you got married, you had to leave the deaconess order. So all of the deaconesses that worked until they retired and died were single and celibate. So understandably, to outside observers, deaconesses and nuns seemed identical. Now, Methodist deaconesses countered, well, we didn't take a lifetime vow, so we can leave the order at any time, and many did leave to marry, to care for aged parents, to recuperate from illness, or just to do something different. They also explained, and I love this, that they had been called by God to be mothers of humanity's orphans. Mothers of humanity's orphans. And if you remember some of those pictures with deaconesses kind of look with street children, that was kind of the sweet spot of what they did. And to ground this theologically and biblically, Lucy Ryder-Meyer wrote one of her most important articles was called The Mother of the Church, and she's talking about deaconesses. So, so they felt that they were fulfilling the maternal role that women are supposed to do because they are mothers of humanity's orphans. Well, the deaconess movement tried to counter in many ways, and one of them was this kind of funny thing. The Roman Catholic Church has nuns. The Methodist Church has none. Thank God. But you look at that. If you looked at them, would you think they were Protestant or Roman Catholic? Kind of, you don't know, right? I mean, and in the chapter I do on the costume or the distinctive dress, it's very similar to the Missionaries of Charity in particular. Anyway. But despite their attempts, whether lighthearted or serious, to neutralize the criticism of being too Catholic, never that criticism just kept going, and they couldn't persuade them otherwise, given their communal life, their dress, and their commitment to religious work, which did not include birthing and nurturing their own biological children. Okay, so we are on to the conclusion. Yes. If we fast forward more than a century, the Methodist deaconess movement today looks vastly different from what I've been just talking to you about for 45 plus minutes, right? While there remains a remnant of Methodist deaconesses in a few European countries, including Germany and Switzerland, the WDO, the Wesley Deaconess Order here in the UK, no longer exists, and there are no longer Methodist deaconesses in New Zealand, Australia, or Canada. In the US, deaconesses in the United Methodist Church, which is my home church, number a little more than 200. They continue their long-standing service in such varied professions as they did before, teaching, nursing, social justice ministries, hospital and hospice chaplaincy, and many aspects of local church ministry. And there are deaconesses in Black Methodist churches like the AME and the AMEZ, and the consecration service for African Methodist Episcopal AME deaconesses has remained the same for 125 years with only one change. So you remember I told you that deaconess manual published in 1902? That service in there has remained the same with one exception, and you're going to like this. The name of Rosa Parks was added to a paragraph on holy women, and so she stands alongside Lydia and Junia and people like that. And this was a decision of the AME General Conference in 2000, who voted to add Rosa Parks' name to this paragraph. And as I hope you all know, she is best known as a civil rights pioneer, but she was also consecrated a deaconess in 1964 in St. Matthew AME in Detroit. And I have it on good authority by a friend of Dennis Dickerson's that she was requested to be buried in her deaconess uniform, and I have been told that that is actually what happened. So a lot of Methodists don't know that Rosa Parks was a deaconess. Currently, the Philippines Annual Conference, which I talked to you about the beginnings, of the United Methodist Church has the highest number of deaconesses at more than 550. So United States, 200-ish, Philippines, 550. And Norma Dolaga, who is a Filipino deaconess, received the World Methodist Council's 2024 Peace Award for 4 decades of service focusing on peace and justice. She has worked to establish safe havens for those targeted by extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. And when she talked about what it meant as her being a deaconess and what the work she did, she said, "The training and the practical ministries that nurtured deaconesses' spiritual and social connections with people became helpful strength in embracing the ministry of compassion, solidarity, and action." The Philippines is still the site of Harris Memorial College in Manila, which continues to offer deaconess training both to Filipino and international students. The college welcomed its first international student, an Indonesian from Sumatra, in 1934, only 30 years after the school was founded. And soon after, it became a multicultural educational institution, preparing the first deaconesses from Malaysia, Taiwan, Japan, and more. Harris Memorial College recently extended its geographic reach with the enrollment of its first African students. Their deaconess training will be pivotal to the newly launched Methodist deaconess movement in Africa. And the first Methodist deaconess consecrated from an African region, Leah Vandera, was consecrated in 2022, and several more were consecrated in 2024. So in these current realities, we see, and I hope it's clear to you, a tremendous geographical shift in the International Methodist Deaconess movement, from its origin in Western countries to its continued emergence and growth in African and Asian countries. So given this current context, perhaps a better title for this paper would be "The Emergence, Growth, Decline, and Rebirth of the International Methodist Deaconess Movement." Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for an enlightening lecture. We have plenty of time for questions. I have a roving microphone, which hopefully will work, which I can bring around. Oh, it was a moment ago. Okay. Well, perhaps while we're working on the microphone, if you have a question you would like to come to the front. Oh no, we can take the microphone around.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. You talked about the limitations of what the deaconesses could do. What were they actually able to do? They were consecrated, so what rights did they have in the Methodist Church? What things could they perform?
Oh, what things? So like rites, sacraments?
Yeah.
They were not allowed. They were not ordained. No. Okay. No, even though in the book I show the similarities between the ordination for clergymen and the consecration for deaconess was almost identical. And I do the same with the theological education they received, which is almost identical. We even have deaconesses who were learning Greek. They couldn't do any sacraments. They preached, and it's evidence that some served churches in the United States. The United States, they had much more openness, and so we do have evidence of some deaconesses serving churches. But I actually don't know, and I'm not sure if we could figure out if they celebrated the sacraments in their, when they were serving a local church, but they were not consecrated to be able to serve sacraments or anything like that.
So what did consecration give them?
It entered them into this office, and they were recognized by the church, I think haphazardly so, murkily so, as church officers. So they went to the meetings and things like that, and they had a say in a restricted way. But it set them apart as deaconesses, and a lot of deaconesses actually could get cheaper fare on trains that ministers got and things like that. But it gave them they felt called to this, and so it gave them a moment in public to have hands laid on them and set off. And I think that, yes, the lifting up in the community was very important to them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd just like to note that anyone who is joining online can ask a question by typing their question into the comments, and we'll read it out for you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Well, Alex, as I said, was very helpful.
Well, has there been any attempt, made to, particularly because there is so little, written evidence of particularly like the AME history, like you mentioned, or of these schools, particularly the deaconess movements, do you know if there's been any attempt made of oral projects, particularly of any like living members who may have known, or grandchildren or grandparents? I know that's becoming more popular in some historical circles and certain movements. So I didn't know if any oral projects have been done or attempted in that.
So not that I know of, and the AME is tricky, and the leading historian of the AME Church and I have had several conversations, Dennis Dickerson, because no work has been done on AME deaconesses at all, and he would be the one to know of it. I can only find reference to one AME deaconess who was consecrated, and she's actually listed in that 1902 deaconess manual. But she was in Chicago, trained in Lucy Ryder Meyer's school. The AME did start a deaconess training school in Roanoke, Virginia, but there are no records. And I don't know if any students attended, and within a number of years, like 5 years or so, the name deaconess has dropped and it becomes kind of a generic school. So it's really tough to know, but the thing is there are deaconesses now in the AME tradition. So I worked so hard with the AMEs and the AMEZs to try to piece together this, because there are also deaconesses in the African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion, the AMEZs. And I don't know, I can't trace when the resurgence came, and I kind of took an historian's, which I gave myself permission to say, it's not really my generation that I'm working on. But I was curious, because obviously they're around now. They were around in the 60s for Rosa Parks to be a deaconess, and they're women who are looked up to in these churches, and I can't piece it together. I mean, I think a lot of the reason why I wrote the book is, yes, I am just enamored of these women, but there's so much work to be done in each country, in each denomination. Here in the UK, Dorothy Graham wrote a fabulous book, Saved to Serve, on British Methodist deaconesses. I mean, you can't do better than that. But that's not, there's so much history to be told, and there's so many gaps. And I'm hoping that maybe this book will maybe people will find dissertation or projects. I keep looking to Dave because he knows everybody and you speak all these languages, so you could point people to these resources. So that's the best I can do. I don't know of any oral history projects. Yeah.
Hi, thanks.
Yes.
In your brilliant list, I love to see that there were only 12 hours of sewing done in a whole year. While all of the other
And I'm a spinner and a knitter, so
Even
I really
might
love
manage
it.
12 hours a year. I'm interested by the importance of singleness to the original movement, and I'm wondering how much those sort of boundaried woman social positions are still part of the deaconess movement now, and I wondered if there are limitations to it.
So I can speak for the United Methodist Church. I don't know about the Philippines. There's not that limitation on it, but I do know a number of deaconesses, and it just so happens that many of them that I know are single at this point. But that's not, and they've also linked together the home missionary movement, which used to be male and deaconesses were female, but then that's kind of been merged together. But there is not in the United Methodist Church that commitment to singleness anymore. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Thanks so much.
Good.
I'm just wondering to what extent the ordination of women impacted the decline of the deaconess order. So in the UK, it did, I think, because I think women, we were ordained in 1974 here, and I think the diaconal order here, the deaconess order, I should say, closed in around about 1978, and then re-emerged as the diaconal order for both men and women later. But it was the ordination of women, really, I think, which lots of the women in the deaconess order wanted to be ordained but weren't able to be. So when that was open to them, they did that instead. Is that true elsewhere? Is what I was wondering.
It is not true in the United States, and I wish I had a magic answer for that. It's the history's a little tricky, and I don't want to get down into weeds, but women up until 1880 could receive a local preacher's license. That was closed down in the 1880 General Conference, and kind of to give women back something, in 1888, the deaconess movement was started. So no longer local preacher women, and that was like Jenny Fowler Willing and Maggie Newton Van Cott and some big names. They could no longer preach with a license, but women could become deaconesses. In 1924, I think it was, women's preaching licenses were reinstated in the Methodist Church, but it wasn't until 1956 that the first woman was fully ordained. So you have this long period, but the problem is it's not as simple because the deaconess movement is already declining before 1924. The high point of enrollment at Chicago training schools around 1914, and then it really precipitous after World War I, as I mentioned. But it's not that clear cut. I can see where it is and I know that history, what you're describing. And the other reality is that the deaconess movement still continues in the United States. It's never stopped. It's much, 200 as opposed to, probably 5,000 or more. And when I know of one deaconess, Willia Caffrey, who went on to get a local preacher's license after being a deaconess, but she's the only one I found. So it's not as clear cut as that, but it's a great question, and it's one I've wrestled a lot with. So, great questions. Jordan had his hand up.
Come on, he has to wait. So Jordan is in the queue. He's a former director of the MWRC, not a present director.
Oh, Jordan is in the queue. Oh, okay.
So all privileges have been revoked. However, we not only have those of us in the room, but we have 30 or so people joining online. We're present tonight not only with the great cloud of witnesses, but also with some witnesses in the cloud.
Okay.
And Jacob is going to give us a question from there.
Well, it's my own question, actually. We don't have any online yet.
Okay, yeah, my family hasn't signed on to ask some rude question.
Steve definitely prepared that last night. Well, thanks, Priscilla. It's really amazing, historical reading, and follows Randy Maddox's lecture really well from last year.
Oh, good. Oh, on Lady Selena?
Yeah, I just think. Anyways. Okay. So I'm curious, as a theologian who works in the Methodist Wesleyan tradition, I think the hope from those of us who work in theology is that our tradition has something generative to say broader, and often other traditions look at us for practical reasons or historical reasons and so on. And so I'm thinking, is there any theological tale here that can be told, whether it be in the sermons of the deaconesses or in journals, or maybe cross country, if there's any kind of narrative there. I think of Phoebe Palmer, how we often look to her theology of perfection critically, but more recently people have looked to her interpretation of Acts 2 and how that led to the empowerment of women. And just wondering, is there, like, I guess my hope is that the Spirit falls upon these deaconesses and that it generates the potential for kind of new theology, which you see in like the Catholic sisters, and you see in other minor movements and orders. And if you saw anything in your reading that might point to something generative there.
That's a great question, Jacob. And for someone who taught theology for 15 years, I should have a more ready answer. Well, let me just take a stab at it, and you can. So, what to me they theologically and practically, I think they tap into some of the same sentiments, trajectories of the early Methodist movement. I mean, I think about how education for the poor and going to places that no one really in their right mind would want to visit. That was their daily life. I mean, I was very excited. There are 2 diaries at the John Rylands and written by deaconesses. They're the only 2 journals I can find anywhere in the world. And I put, if you don't buy the book for anything else, buy them for these diaries. I put big extracts from them, and I've annotated all of them, which was a lot of work. But they are, like one of them, Thurza Masters, lives near the docks in Cardiff. And I mean, this is rough. And she's living there. And it just seems to me that so much, I don't know, theologically, there's not a lot of theological talk, to be honest, in their writing, like in their, Iva Durham Bernard does, she does it, but she's holiness. I mean, she does a lot with sanctification. But I think those same, movements, that motivated early Methodism to be among the poor is so alive. I mean, I did my dissertation on liberation theology, and looking at it from that lens, I don't know if they would have a preferential option for the poor, but they are in it with the poor. And it's not easy, and they get angry. They wish people that wouldn't, get drunk and come home and beat their wives and all of that. But they just, day after day, 6, 7 calls a day in these kinds of situations. So I don't know. In some ways, they were so busy, immersed in the dregs of life, that I don't see them stepping back to, so it's not that perfect circle of praxis theology. It's not that. And in this Thurza Masters, it is so tragic. She has such a breakdown that she is hospitalized. She's down to like 90. I don't know. It does it in stones, and I tried to. You all would understand the weight, but she got down to like nothing, and she is in complete isolation. And the only person she sees is like her a nurse that sometimes gives her a massage, and she calls her Angel, and she's tracking the little bit of weight that she gains. It's just. They gave it their all. I don't know how to say it. They put, it's kind of like Romans 12:1. I mean, you put your body on the altar, to quote Palmer, and they put their bodies and their minds and everything they were into this ministry. So, I mean, I'm not answering you theologically, and I know there's probably a lot of theology there, but they studied theology. They had a harder theological education than any seminary student that I know. And so they could do it. But I think they were so geared to to the practice. Yeah, that's not a great answer, but it shows you some of my heart for them. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that theological education. So in each of the sort of schools that are being set up, who is directing the curriculum, who's teaching them, how are they coming to it, how uniform are they across the different places where people could study? Yeah,
it's a great question, and I don't mean to keep saying it, but I do have one of my chapters in the book. So in the States, there was a bishop's course of study that was developed, and it included, well, like Meyer, who was director of this Illinois Sunday School Association and knew how illiterate people were in the Bible. She had her deaconesses study every 66 books. They could do maps, they could do teaching on all of them. In the mornings, they studied, and then in the afternoon, they did their practical work. So it was a lovely balance of mind and, body. But they studied in the 2 years that was required for most deaconesses. They studied Bible, they studied deeply into church history, they studied theology, and they did a lot of reading on women in the church. Frances Willard's book, Women in the Pulpit, and then just some of the deaconess work. They if they were what they called visitors, they would study evangelism and how do you present the gospel and that kind of thing. If they were nurses, then they would learn that. They were taught, some of the theology and Bible was taught by local Methodist ministers. So like Samuel Chadwick, he's in some of the work that I did in John Rylands, he's listed as one of their tutors. And, these were often men with PhDs who were also preachers. They also had deaconesses teaching deaconesses. And that was one of the things that got that the St. Louis guy who kicked Iva Durham-Bernard out, he said, we want men teaching theology and Bible. We want preachers. Because she had women so it did vary a bit, but there was kind of that same general pattern. And what's lovely about Annie Pitt's diary is that she talks about the different lectures they had. They also learned basic first aid, so they talk about how to tie bandages and stuff. They had a well-rounded education, but deeply theological.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Now you're in the queue.
Thanks. It's been great to see how this project is developed.
Yeah, you've heard it. You've heard it in different stages.
I've heard various papers over the years. One curiosity question I have is whether you've seen any examples anywhere in the world of Methodist deaconesses interacting with Catholic nuns. The main question, I think, relates a little bit to what Julie said in terms of the rebirth in a Western example. Today you have the kind of rebirth in the British Methodist Church with the deacon order, which puts all people, men and women, together in one order. Do you see that as a kind of continuation of this, or would you suggest kind of ongoing deaconess order?
Let me answer the first one first. I'm going through my brain. I can't come up with an example of where deaconesses and nuns actually kind of came together. There was both. They were loath to talk about or to see the connections, and at the same time, you have like Lucy Ryder Meyer even, wishing that the Methodist Church would be more like the Roman Catholic Church and support the nuns, and and so there was both a feeling of we don't want to be them, but they've got some perks and the education that they received and all of that. So, but I can't think of an example where they're actually coming together or working together. I think I like the way that the British Methodist Church has brought male and female together, and I think that's kind of what the United Methodist Church has done with deaconesses and home missioners now all in one group, so to speak. I do think women's ordination really does play a role in that. At the same time, I'm glad that there is still an office of deaconess where those who don't feel called to, to word and sacrament, as I felt, I'm looking at Jack. I'm thinking of Jack, who has been a lifelong Bible teacher, never wanted to be ordained, but, he's filling a role in the church, but not in an office, so to speak. And I think for people who want to continue doing their work, but have it brought into the church in some kind of capacity, either for reporting or authority or more spiritual input, in a sense, in their career, I like that idea a lot. But, for women in particular, when you have the ability to be ordained, but see, I had never heard of the deaconesses, so maybe, I don't know. I think it's murkier now, is what I'm trying to say. It was murky then, I think it may be even worse now. Is that a cop-out answer?
I think that's exactly right.
Thank you for the clicker.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
So I'm stuck at the Henry comment.
You're stuck at what?
That comment that the pastor.
Oh, the Henry. I'm Henry VIII, I am.
Yes, that's unbelievable. But I wanted to make a comment about theology, and you did a little circle theology praxis. But I'm wondering if their theology was praxis. In the sense that
beautifully
they
said.
had to have had a conceptual framework that drove this kind of serious work. Mm-hmm. And they were trained as, in theological disciplines, and to be doing that so committedly had to have had some form of theological framework.
Yeah.
Maybe not articulated. And it would be interesting to figure out where that would rest and to unearth it, to hear what is it that drove their compassion, their standing juxtapositionally with people, the poor. I wanted to ask now.
Before you go on, I really like that because they were practicing their theology. Yeah. And when we have, like in the Highways and Hedges, which was the British Deaconess magazine, they'll do like little vignettes of little bios. And these women felt absolutely called to this. And they would articulate that like, I felt called to the ministry, or we would say, so there was a definite conversion and there was a definite call. And out of those two experiences came this lived, practiced theology that you're talking about. Yeah.
So I'm just so broken that, this thing has died or is being reborn, right, or, whatever it is. Because it's so impacting with the kind of needs that we have in our world today.
Right.
What's the politics like now? I mean, it's evident that it was heavy back then, and I'm sure it was mirroring contemporary life with women and all of that good stuff. But what is it now? We know it's a small amount, 200 in the US, 550 in the Philippines. Right. What is the position of I'm sure some of it died a little bit with the ordination of women and all of that, but is there still this kind of reticence, not wanting to hatch,
Yeah.
that kind of language, what's the position now?
I think, thank you for your thoughtful question. My sense, so I had the opportunity, kind of the head of the deaconess movement in my tradition in the Methodist Church, she's a recruiter and things like that, lives in Fort Worth. And so we met halfway between Dallas and Fort Worth for coffee, and it was lovely. And she helped me really understand where these things are now, because I'm an historian. And so that earlier generation is my sweet spot. So I would say that it is still pushing for recognition. I mean, it's been recognized, but maybe that's not the way to say it. It is pushing for influence. And I think part of it is the numbers are so small, and you're spread out in a big country like the United States. And so there's not like it's hard to lobby, which you have to do at General Conference. You have to gather groups together and actually push something through. But having said that, I think there is a resurgence, and that gives me hope that this can continue. And I think they're continuing to adjust how they are presented, what they're doing. It was so cool. I got a text from a young woman that I've known for a while. I didn't even know she was studying to be a deaconess, and she was she sent her stole and everything. I was consecrated a deaconess, and I think it's catching on with younger people too, which is encouraging for me. That it's not, they'll have longer to be moving this along, this momentum. So, yeah. And I have never been to the Philippines, but Leo Neto, who's the president of the World Methodist Council, has said, we may be doing I want to go there and just see. I mean, I've corresponded with people in the Philippines, but I just don't have a sense what I think it's much more prominent there than it is anywhere else. Not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of influence.
We have 2 more questions. And lest you think I was unfairly mean to Jordan, I'm making David Bundy wait now.
Thank you for your paper. Did the Deaconess movement interact at all with images or theologies of like Mary or Macrina? Did they reach for any of these early female disciples or monastics?
Phoebe. Sorry, did I interrupt
That's
you?
okay. Yeah, just
I'm sorry,
finish
your question.
Yeah, to legitimize themselves was the end of that phrase.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I was shaking my head at Mary and Macrina, and then you went on, and they really, really lived into Phoebe. And just, that was Romans, 16:1? 16:1, I'm looking at my two. She became really I don't know what to call it, emblem in a sense. I mean, Phoebe was their sweet spot. But they studied. I mean, it's so interesting that you asked that question, because they're reading all sort of decades of church history, so to speak. But I just don't see any other women really popping up besides Phoebe. Yeah.
They would have had so much in common with like Macrina's whole school.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, I like Macrina. Yeah, that's a great question.
And
Okay.
Just one more question, concise, I'm sure, from David Bundy.
The question would be, I would love to hear you reflect for a moment or two on the holiness, the connections with the holiness networks of the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah. So one of the decisions I made that was really hard for me, because I like to study the holiness movement, right? And I've even visited the Nazarene archives and things like that. One of the decisions I made just to keep this book somewhat finishable was that I really leaned into Methodism and what?
And so how do you explain the East and West London mission without, and deaconesses within the UK without that?
Okay, well, we may need to talk about this, but I was thinking just the holiness movement, because I know their deaconesses. Yes. As far as I know, the only one that crossed over really was Venard. And then her student, Willia Caffrey, who then went on to get the preaching license. But I don't see the deaconess movement in the holiness movement as being anywhere, as robust. And I just suggested to Jordan that it would be fun to get together a panel, like with Christy in Free Methodism and maybe Stan or somebody in the Nazarene, because I would love to do, but have other people contribute to, let's look at this more broadly, because I realize that and I'm expecting to be criticized, but I drew some parameters that I thought made most sense with the book. But I don't see a lot with the holiness movement, Church of Nazarene and Free Methodism. But anyway, I don't see a lot of crossover, if that was your question. No, it wasn't?
We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
There's plenty more to
we
continue
can't end on
discussing.
that.
Well,
Just
now
teasing.
you've put me in an awkward position.
No, I'm just teasing. These people need to get to dinner.
Yeah, let's show our appreciation for Thank you for all your work in a very stimulating lecture. Thank you to everyone who contributed to the conversation. And I'd like to thank a couple of the organizers for the event too. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my forebear, Jordan Hammond, in his work in the MWRC and his foreplanning that's gone into events such as these. The work of my colleagues, David Bundy, Jacob Lett. Thank you to Cameron, who has overseen our tech this evening, stepping in at the 11th hour and rescuing us. You can only hear my voice now because of Cameron. Respond to that as you will. And just a reminder that tomorrow morning we have our MWRC colloquium, where a number of you will be presenting papers, and it should be an enriching continuation of this conversation. Until then, go in peace.